French President Emmanuel Macron has announced a reduction in the number of French troops battling militants in the Sahel region of West Africa. Macron says that the troops will now be operating as part of broader international efforts in the region.
France's operation battling jihadist militants in the Sahel region of West Africa is to come to an end. President Emmanuel Macron making that announcement on Thursday.
Bonjour.
And saying that French troops will instead operate as part of broader international efforts in the region. Referring to the 5,100-strong Barkhane counter-terrorism force, Macron said, "The time has come to begin a deep transformation of our military presence in the Sahel."
C'est impossible. Ou alors c'est un travail sans fin.
The former colonial power has claimed some success against militants in recent months. But the situation remains extremely fragile and, with no apparent end in sight, Paris has grown frustrated. Some 55 soldiers have died since France first intervened in 2013. Political turmoil has also been a concern. The troop reduction decision comes just days after Malian Army Colonel Assimi Goïta took power after overthrowing his second president in 9 months. Earlier on Thursday, French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian was in Ivory Coast cutting the ribbon on a new counter-terrorism academy. He said the International Academy for the Fight Against Terrorism in Abidjan would help regional states step up their military, security and judicial cooperation. Macron said details of the changes would be finalised by the end of June. That's after consultations with the United States, European nations involved in the region and the 5 Sahel countries: Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania.
Well, to give us a little bit more understanding of what all of this means, we're now joined by David Otto, who's a counter-terrorism and organised crime specialist from Kigali in Rwanda. David, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.
All right, so, one gets a sense this is the kind of fatigue that we've seen America have in the Middle East, and they're starting to withdraw their troops. And maybe the Mali situation was the excuse that Macron had to pull troops out generally from the region.
I think you're very correct. This is another example of why big countries, find it very difficult to win small wars. As you also know, Operation Barkhane, which is where the French government is saying, President Macron is saying that, it comes to an end. This operation has been there since 2012, just after the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi from Libya. It was specifically meant to, of course, tackle the issues with the rising jihadist groups in the Liptako-Goma region. But this was specifically done for Mali. But since this operation, there's been increase in terms of the capacity of terrorist groups operating in this region. So the results of Operation Barkhane have been fairly poor. So that could be one of the reasons why the French president thinks, it's an opportunity for him to end this Operation Barkhane. But of course, one other issue is that this operation lacks a great deal of local support. We saw during the coup d'etat that led to the overthrow of President Boubacar Keïta, where the population had risen and said, insecurity was the order of the day. So France was under severe pressure. Some of the jihadist groups, like they did in Taliban and Afghanistan, they had demanded that the French withdraw their forces as a condition, for peace to reign. So that could be at the back of the French president's mind. In addition to that, you've had French casualties, and then the latest coups, have not helped the situation. But again, other operations, have French forces involved. The G5 Sahel, as you mentioned, they are part of MINUSMA, which is the United Nations missions in Mali, and also part of Operation Barkhane, which is the EU mission. So it's, going out of the window, but perhaps returning through the door.
Does this mean that France is almost accepting that its influence on the continent is lessening and that they just putting their hands up and saying, you know, there's nothing more we can do in some areas, we're just not the France of old?
I think what France is trying to do is to, you know, not present itself as, you know, the French colony that it used to be, you know, just before independence and after that. There's been a huge level of criticism from its former colonies, Mali being one of them, all the Liptako-Goma regions, Burkina Faso, Niger Republic. So I think what is happening here is that France is losing a lot of support internally, and it's been challenged by countries like China, but also Russia in the region. So because it's not producing results, you know, as it claims, you know, to have come in for that purpose, you know, they are faced with, you know, the circumstances where they cannot longer do what they used to do before. This is made worse by the fact that the military in Mali does not support French presence, and you cannot deal with counterinsurgency when you don't have the support of the local military and security services. So I think they have no choice but to pull out.
What does this mean then for the fight against these militant insurgents? Without French troops on the ground, is the fight weakened, or will they draw on other resources and perhaps even other countries?
It depends on, you know, which side of the fence you're sitting on. You know, first of all, the presence of France has not subsided. You know, the jihadist activities have increased. They haven't subsided since 2012. So therefore, the argument that pulling out France will increase the level of, you know, jihadist activities, there is no proof about that. I think what needs to be done is for Malians to be given a chance, but also the African Union perhaps, or, you know, other regional states. You know, they should be able to have an opportunity to come up with a counterintelligence, you know, insurgency strategy that will deal with the current presence of the Islamic State of Greater Sahel and the Al-Qaeda, you know, coalitions. So one would think that by France pulling out, it leaves a huge gap. But you can only say that if there is evidence that backs up that kind of an assessment. For now, I think, you know, it should be given a local platform. You know, the Malians should try their best, and, you know, let's see what happens. I mean, the Al-Qaeda factions have made it very clear that if France pulls out, then a local solution, you know, can be reached. But, you know, nobody can trust anybody in this case.
Might this be an opportunity for a superpower like Russia to come in and be seen as someone who can try and help save the day? I know that the military in Mali had started some conversations with Russia.
Well, you know, when one superpower pulls out from the African region, there is another one that is ready to fill its boots. And as you rightly mentioned, there are talks about Russia, you know, putting its feet on the door and saying to Mali that we will supply you with the kind of backup that has no strings attached. Now, whether this is going to be a long-term solution, whether this is going to be a way of getting in and, you know, doing the same thing that France did, you know, this has not been tried. But, you know, from the experience that one has seen, especially in the case of Syria, where Russia intervened, you know, to stop the regime change, you know, one would have to give them another opportunity to see if they can play a better role. But what I advocate for is a local intervention. I don't think the intervention of Russia will help as much as an effective intervention of Mali and the African Union, which, you know, should be the principal, you know, a coordinator of, you know, counterinsurgency in the continent. So yes, you know, Russia may come into play, you know, after France leaves, but I still think, you know, it should be an African-led, you know, a strategy rather than, you know, any Western powers.
France is almost talking in code. I'm not quite sure what it means when they talk about a deep change in strategy and having a broader involvement in the region. What does that actually mean? Or is that code for we're actually on our way out and we're leaving in bits and pieces?
Well, it depends on, it's very difficult to tell what the French government is saying. But, remember that France does not just have Operation Barkhane. They've got involvement, they've got their forces, within the G5 Sahel. That still remains there. They've got Operation Takuba, which is a European-led mission. France is still part of that operation. They're still supporting the MINUSMA operations. And so even though one would think that France is leaving through the Operation Barkhane, which had about 5,100 forces, I still think that what France is doing is to leverage its presence in the region and say, listen, I'm not just alone. I've got European partners also here. I'm not just the only one interested in this continent. It's a way of leaving the country and then coming back through another form. So let's not count France out altogether. But it's going to be interesting how different powers would come in and how the scenario is going to look like. Tough times ahead.
What's in it for France in terms of getting in there in the first place and trying to help fight these insurgencies? America in the Middle East was always about, we have to try and fight Al-Qaeda, otherwise we're going to have another Twin Towers scenario. And that's why our troops are on the ground over there. Was France under the same danger?
It's a complete different danger. I mean, France sees most of its former colonies as Francophonie. They had this policy of assimilation, which meant French colonies were part of France. And that mentality, has not changed a bit. The French influence in Mali is a very important country. Remember, it borders with countries like Central African Republic, Niger, Chad, and Libya, for example, which is one of the countries where France is also interested in. So by having an influence within those countries, it helps France to bid for its other interests, which could include the resources, it could include investment, but more importantly, holding on to its former colonies. And this is something that, if France loses Mali, then it is likely to lose a grip, on all the other countries. Remember, it is being challenged very seriously in Central African Republic by Russia, and they don't want to lose Mali as well as soon as they've lost, Central African Republic.
All right, you are a proponent of homegrown solutions. I guess for those fighting these insurgents, they also now to rethink, do we fight or do we finally sit down and talk?
I mean, the question is always, whether or not, should we talk or should we not talk? It all depends on the negotiations. What is the trade-off? What is the Malian government ready to give out in order for it to have, some kind of a negotiation with the various armed militias and jihadist groups that operate in the country? I always advocate that, both the, what we refer to as the carrot and the stick solution are tried. You've got to talk, but at the same time, you've got to show that you have the ability, to diminish the capacity of these armed groups. At present, the country is in a very precarious situation, especially Mali, because of the current chaos that the coup, the double coup, has given the country. So I think it's a matter of, trying to balance between, what it takes to fight the war and what it takes to talk. But, having groups like ISIS, the Islamic State of the Greater Sahel, present in the country gives very little hope that you can achieve talking. But the Al-Qaeda factions, from experience, are much more willing to talk. But listen, it might just be the same situation in the Taliban, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where one faction ready to talk, the other one not ready to talk. All this is down to internal discussions. And it's too early to determine whether which will work, effectively for Mali.
Yeah, a lot of discussions and strategies and unknowns to navigate, certainly in the whole Sahel region. And one suspects each country is going to have to find a unique solution for their own circumstances. David, always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Likewise.